what would a reimagined government look like that was better oriented to solving or making progress with those types of complex challenges, rather than wishing that the world were more simple and manageable, and using the sort of old top-down hierarchical approaches, which we know don't work for the types of challenge we face. But by optimizing for control, you probably are not going to optimize for learning. And in the face of uncertainty and complexity, it's learning that actually counts. Control is kind of a false is a false sense of control, because it's like the extent to which you control a garden, right, or an ecosystem. You can play a part in it, but you are not in control. We wrote something quite a few years ago now called which we called a manifesto for a better government, which included a set of values and principles. I'll just read out the values because it sort of resonates with what you were saying. So the values we think are underplayed today and should be more celebrated and more cultivated in government are humility, openness, empathy, authenticity, trust, curiosity, and diversity.
Today, I have with me an international friend who is in Sweden right now, and we'll hear more about his background, but it's Adrian Brown, and he's with the Center for Public Impact. And we had a short conversation before getting started, and I'm really excited to delve into this and talk more about impacts of government and public. So maybe you could tell us a little bit first about yourself and all about the Center for Public Impact.
Yes, happy to, and thanks for having me on. I've listened to a few episodes of the podcast. I think it's a great podcast that you've got going here. So the Center for Public Impact is a not-for-profit foundation that was founded about 10 years ago with the goal of reimagining government, and I can explain a little bit about what that is in a second. But in terms of my background, I have worked in and around the public sector mainly, both as a policymaker advisor in the UK government back when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, but then also in think tanks and as a consultant working with different bits of government and the public sector. And as you mentioned, I now live in Sweden. I'm British by birth, but now live in Sweden, have a family here in Sweden. And I've worked internationally, so I've got experience working with and around the public sector in different parts of the world. I suppose the relevant bit about my background that led me to found the Center for Public Impact and the work we do today was back in sort of the early 2000s when I was working in the Blair administration. I was involved with something called the Delivery Unit, which was a centralized unit for driving government performance on health, education, transport targets. And it became quite well known, certainly within the UK, and then elsewhere in the world as a sort of a mechanism for driving performance, if you like. If you want to achieve this target in health or education, then you can set up a delivery unit. And at the time, I thought this was great. You know, I could see that public sector bureaucracies are often inefficient. They're often not oriented around clear objectives. And so having this unit in the center driving progress seemed like it made a ton of sense to me. But then latterly, I began to realize that approach makes certain assumptions about the world and about the role of government that potentially turn out not to be true in some pretty important cases, right? So if we think about the types of challenge that we face in the world today, many of them, you might describe them as sort of wicked problems in the sense that they're complex, they are changing, they are hard to put a boundary around and say, here's the problem. Yeah. They're hard to even understand sort of what progress looks like or what success looks like because they're multi factors and many different perspectives at play. So these are sort of complex, wicked, systemic problems like the climate crisis, like an aging population, like many things we can think of that we expect our policymakers to wrestle with and make progress with. And given those types of problems, the institutions and approaches and models of government, of which a delivery unit approach would be one, are actually fairly ill-suited. So those approaches, the sort of hierarchical managerial approaches, are best suited when a problem is well defined. You can understand what progress looks like, exactly the opposite of what I was just describing. And And yet all of our government institutions today are still trying often to use these same old ways of working and the same institutional setups, despite the fact that we're trying to make progress with these much more complex, much more systemic problems. So what the work we do at CPI is about asking, what would government look like? And that's why we say reimagining government. What would a reimagined government look like that was better oriented to solving or making progress with those types of complex challenges, rather than wishing that the world were more simple and manageable, and using the sort of old top-down hierarchical approaches, which we know don't work for the types of challenge we face.
It's so interesting that what you're saying too. And I don't know if, do you think this is recognized across government, or is it something that they don't really want to dive into? Like, let's just keep our heads down. Let's keep doing what we're doing, and maybe nobody will notice.
So look, a lot of smart people work in government, right? And that's true on the sort of civil service side, as it is true on the political side. And then it's true for the wider public sector as well, in health, education, etc. I think what we often find is that people who work within these systems have a form of cognitive dissonance, where they recognize that the system within which they're working is pretty ill-suited for the challenges at hand. But there isn't really a strategy for them to adopt other than just to keep on plugging away within that system, because the possibility of really changing everything seems so huge and hopeless that it perhaps just makes more sense to ignore that problem and carry on with whatever bit of the system you're working in, and try and do your best. So I think it is recognized. The problem is what to do about it. So it's a pretty difficult, wicked problem itself to wrestle with. And in the face of that, and the face of political expectations that we want to see results, we want to be able to show progress in an electoral cycle or in the short run, the incentives for actually really changing the system fundamentally are not strong enough to, often we believe, to make the kinds of changes that we think are necessary.
So when you say the incentives, you mean people involved, they're not incentivized to make change because they're just one little plug, or
yeah, and it's such a huge challenge. So often we frame this as a paradigm shift. So the paradigm within which a lot of government and public sector activity operates is what you might call a sort of managerial paradigm, where and there's a great book, by the way, called Seeing Like a State, which was written by a philosopher called James C. Scott. I think it was published in the 90s sometime, which captures this, that says, the state has a way of viewing the world, which is kind of part of its DNA. It's to say, let's try and measure and manage and control things so that we can improve this dimension or that dimension. And that's basically how the state is and raise taxes and do all the other things that a state needs to do. But that sort of paradigm of like, we are ultimately trying to manage and control things is not a paradigm that works in complexity and with a more systemic approach. So getting out of that paradigm requires not just shifting sort of practices and processes, but shifting mindsets and beliefs at a much, much deeper level. And even if you realize that as an individual or a group of individuals, how you go about doing that is hugely difficult. And so, given people expect results and people expect things to be fixed sort of on a short order, the incentive to actually change the system more fundamentally is really not high enough.
So, I think I've asked this question before to some other guests, and I'm wondering, or maybe I was debating it in my head, is the issue really that complicated, or are we making it complicated? Because like, I'm very practical, and I always, like, I hear lots of people complaining, not everyone, and saying there's, you can't do it. One person can't change everything. But I don't know if all these problems in how we're governing are that complicated, or is it that we're complicating this? So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I think the the problem that we try to manage and control things more than is sensible, and we should adopt other strategies like empowering people, like devolving power, like making information more available, widely available.
Mm-hmm.
Those are not complicated things. Like probably what
Yeah,
I just said would be understood by my 8-year-old son, right? So
right.
that is not complicated. The challenge is that there are a lot of reasons not to do those things, to maintain the status quo, basically, that keep us locked in a sort of stasis. So I would agree with you that what we're proposing here is not difficult to grasp, but actually making that happen just empirically seems to be rather difficult because it doesn't happen very easily.
Yeah, I didn't expect your answer, but I'm very much in agreement with it. Is that, and that's why I started the organization called Empowered Canadians, because I'm trying to elevate the conversation and empower Canadians to understand the issue so that we could tackle it on an elevated level. Because I think that's what I found over these last few years is that there's a lack of knowledge and understanding of how to get involved to make those
Mm-hmm.
changes. In your answer, though, you did mention obstacles that come in the way or hindrances. And can you touch on that a little bit? What your thoughts are on those?
So one would be that uh, there's often a often a treasury function where whatever that treasury function is in the particular government will expect quite a fine degree of accounting for reasons that are fairly easy to understand about how public money is spent, and there'll be
Yeah.
various tests of value for money tests and making sure that the money wasn't being used for things which it shouldn't be, and on one level that makes a ton of sense. But when you hold people to account very finely for how money is spent, that basically creates an industry of people justifying why this project is good and why that project is good, and look at these great results that we've achieved with this and the other. And it doesn't actually encourage a kind of open, honest conversation about what works, what doesn't work, where things have gone
Mm.
wrong, and how we can learn from it. So one of the principles we push for at CPI are optimizing for learning rather than control. A lot of our systems are optimized for control, and that there are obvious reasons for that, because you don't want things to be chaotic. But by optimizing for control, you probably are not going to optimize for learning. And in the face of uncertainty and complexity, it's learning that actually counts. Control is kind of
Yeah.
a false is a false sense of control, because it's like the extent to which you control a garden, right, or an ecosystem. You can play a part in it, but you are not in control. And actually, what's more important is how that is changing and evolving over time and adapting to changing circumstances. And that's exactly the same with our public systems. We should be optimizing those to be adaptive learning systems rather than static controlled systems from the top.
Just again, it doesn't seem so complicated when you say it that way. And I think you mentioned it earlier. If it's a problem that you know like how to make dinner or whatever more efficiently, then yes, you can optimize for control. But none of the issues that government is supposed to tackle, minus maybe on a municipal level because it's more essential services, so there, yes, you can optimize for control. But then the social issues, you would think that we're optimizing for learning, because how do you control these issues? You can't. They're social issues by definition.
Yeah,
Very interesting. Yeah.
exactly.
And is
Um,
anyone talking about this, or is it just you and I?
well, we're talking about it. That's a start. Um, the example we often point to is building a bridge. Like if you're building a bridge, it's a known problem, you can bound that problem, and you can
Yeah.
say we need this much steel, we need this many rivets, we've got to build a timeline and a Gantt chart and all the rest of it. But when you're talking about tackling a challenge like drug
Yeah.
abuse or domestic violence, or these are not things where you can say if we do X, then Y will happen, because straight out the gate, you can say, well, any individual is such a complex set of factors and situations that you could never say this one program is going to fix it for everybody,
Yeah.
right? But because we have that control mindset, which is actually, it's part of, it's a sort of an engineering mindset, it's a management mindset, it's a not a crazy mindset. We are taught it in our education system, and if you do an MBA or whatever, a lot of these ways of thinking are widely shared and built upon. It's just that they work perfectly well in certain circumstances. It's just that they're not very well suited for exactly the kind of challenge that we now face from a policy perspective. And there are actually a whole other suite of tools available. So you have to, if you look instead of to the engineering discipline, if you look to systems thinking and complexity science, there's lots of ways of dealing with these kinds of challenges that people have tried in different domains and tested and explored. So we could, and our argument is simply, let's make more use of those. Let's be more influenced by those ways of framing the problem, those ways of thinking that don't center us as the policymaker or the politician sitting at the top, that center the nature of the problem and the system itself, and just be honest and a bit humble about our ability to single-handedly fix things, and instead open the doors for a much wider, more diverse involvement from a whole range of different actors, which is much, much likely to get to a better solution. But in the end, you won't be able to say, I, the heroic leader, take the credit for it, because it'll be obvious that it was something that was co-created.
That's very interesting. And I'm going to throw something at you that might be a bit controversial. Maybe not. Maybe you've thought about this. But I've often wondered if it would help to have more female roles in these positions, because it's interesting. You said engineering and you have to be humble, and no disrespect to the male sex, but usually that's the sex, that the gender that has that, ego and drive and engineer. And that's how your brain works. Whereas women are very societal, empathetic, want to work collaboratively. And I've always been thinking, if we just have a better balance, at least on the top, I think it would be helpful. So is that something you've been considering? Is that not at all controversial, maybe even?
Look, I personally don't think that's controversial. I think it's, I think the broader point is that the way our, many of our institutions, and particularly for this conversation, the governmental institutions, view the world is a very particular way of viewing the world. And whether you call that a male way or an engineering way or a managerial way or whatever, it's a very particular way. It has certain characteristics that it emphasizes and other characteristics that are de-emphasized. There are certain skills and capabilities that are celebrated and other skills and capabilities which are not so celebrated. And there are certain types of people with certain types of background that are historically more represented in those systems. And then, of course, there are many, many others who are not. And just as a basic point, increasing the diversity of the groups of people who are involved in around these tables would automatically achieve one of the things I'm arguing for, which is to not just view the world in a single way, right? To not have that narrow lens, but to have different perspectives and to be open to the possibility that there are different perspectives, and not just people arguing one thing over the other, but to say, actually, this richness that comes from these very different starting points is something we can make use of, rather than be afraid of or try to say, no, we all must agree at the end of the day. We have we wrote something quite a few years ago now called which we called a manifesto for a better government, which included a set of values and principles. I'll just read out the values because it sort of resonates with what you were saying. So the values we think are underplayed today and should be more celebrated and more cultivated in government are humility,
Mm.
openness, empathy, authenticity, trust, curiosity, and diversity. And that, I don't want to make a gendered comment necessarily, but look, those are the values which we think we need to see more of. And if you imagine the opposites of all of those things, then that's unfortunately what we see more of in our systems today, I believe.
Yeah, and I think it's important that it's not artificial elevation of people or a gender, and we're seeing a lot of those issues. And even from looking at my own podcast guests, I thought about it for a second because very male dominated. And I'm very organic with when I people reach out to me or I reach out to people. Uh, you could see that there's a lot more males that are putting their hand up to take on these positions and have these discussions, whereas you don't see it, which is something very interesting to me. Then also, when I put myself in the public spotlight, not intentionally, it just happened. I then realized why people shy away and don't put up their hand to take on a public role, or be in a position of influence or power or something like that. Um, it's not a pleasant place to be. You get challenged by everyone, more than just challenged, disparaged by everyone on every side. So I think, kind of going back to my earlier question, um, is it that complicated? And that's why I focus so much on education, is trying to elevate the conversation so that we're not, at least disparaging people. Let's just start there, maybe, and then more women will come out again, and not
Mm-hmm.
artificially, because I think that doesn't help the conversation at all either.
Yeah, I, I think that's right, and I guess some people can dismiss what I'm arguing for as very sort of wishful thinking, and it can never be achieved, and it's against human nature, or we're never going to be able to
Well,
elevate this.
what would they
But
be arguing, though, that wouldn't be able to be elevated?
well, maybe they would say. Often people say, well, look, in the media climate we have, in the political climate that we have, which is very adversarial and very, um, you know, it is very quick to jump on any small error or any small mistake and really hound people as a result of it, which is partially the
Okay.
experience you're describing, right?
Yeah.
In that environment, why would anyone be humble enough to say, I don't think I know what the answer to that is, or um, let's take a more open approach where we bring a whole range of different views together, rather than saying, yep, here's the plan that's going to solve this problem.
Yeah.
So I do understand that one, but there are examples of a different way, right? Often those examples are at the local level, where communities and local governments and civil society and other actors can come together around in a locality, and form relationships and different ways of working that perhaps are difficult at higher levels of the system. So I think we can look at often to localities and to other forms of organizing that show us what's possible. In Sweden, where I live, as we said at the beginning, there's actually a decades-long tradition in the summertime. This happened just a few weeks ago, of all the political parties and the media and representatives from business and the unions and everybody else coming together for what is effectively a festival of ideas and politics on an island in the Baltic Sea. Um, and they all gather together. It's broadcast on TV. The sessions are all open to the public, and spend a week talking about what are the big issues, in whether that's in Swedish society or in the world. What do we think? Lots of views will be shared. Different views will be shared, and it's a space for exchange, dialogue, and mutual learning. It's not a space for arguing at each other and shouting each other down, which is such a precious space in the
Hmm.
modern in the modern world, right? And very hard space to come across, especially online. But it shows you that it's possible, right? Now, not everywhere's Sweden. I get that. There's a very specific culture here, but it shows you that it is possible to imagine a different way of approaching the challenges we face that is much more open, inclusive, and humble than many of the ways we approach it today.
So interesting. And I was going to ask you if you see examples. So I'd like to talk about that a bit more as well. But before we go there, it's interesting that you were saying, in this climate with the adversarial and you can't admit a mistake. To me, I think that's something we created as well. Like coming from a legal background, that's my job, is we're adversaries. But at the same time, you're collegial about it. It's not, there's other interests, and you have to recognize somebody else has a different interest, and somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose, and we move on. That is life. So it's very normal to me. Of course, I want to win, but it doesn't always happen. That isn't life. And then with mistakes, I just resonated with that so much because I think that's something elected officials allowed themselves to be elevated or put on a pedestal, that they're not going to have make a mistake and then they have to apologize for everything. I think that's so ridiculous and so silly, because what we started with is these are very complicated social issues, and we need to learn and we need to understand. If something isn't working, let's, change focus, change direction, and see maybe this will work. But instead, we've been like suggesting or elevating these elected officials that the day before they were just a regular Canadian or a regular Swede. And then all of a sudden they have some power and they're supposed to have all the answers to everything. And I think that's just silly if you look at it. And I think that we just need to own that and not expect perfection from anyone, because that's not reality. So I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
I agree with that. I think part of it, though, is again coming back to the sort of paradigm within which we're operating. If we think that we have control, then I suppose it's fair enough to say, well, it hasn't worked out as we expected, so it's your fault because you were in charge. But that is all a myth. That was all a myth in the first place anyway. So so that's part of what is perpetuating this sense that, we need to hold these people to account when something is not achieved, which actually in holding them to account, we're also giving up our responsibility as being part of the same system, right? Because it's sort of convenient for us to say, oh, you didn't fix homelessness in our city, so that's on you. When actually there's lots and lots of players involved in a challenge like that. So you end up with this quite high stakes situation, which is somebody says, I've identified a problem, and here's the program that's going to solve it. I'm launching the new so-and-so program that's going to, over the next 3 years, address homelessness in this place. And then when the results turn out to be different from what was expected, people are obviously annoyed about that. But the whole framing was wrong in the first place. If you said, I've identified this as a challenge, how are we going to work together? How can we create a system in this place where lots of actors can come in and work together in interesting ways and fail on a micro level, try different things, experiment, learn, and create a system that is built around learning and improvement that I'm not going to be in charge of directly. I'll sort of stewarding, or my responsibility is convening this in some way. Then that's just a completely different framing from the beginning. And then failure, to the extent that it happens, doesn't happen at the whole. 3 years later, everyone realizes that the thing didn't work. It happens continuously on a small level, and that's actually beneficial because then people learn. And if you don't fail, you don't learn anything. At CPI, we have a program called Failing Forward, which is actually for local public officials to get comfortable with the idea that failure happens, and in fact, it's essential for learning. And when it does happen, how do we respond? What do we do? How do we celebrate it in a sense, and then use it to move forward?
Makes total sense. I think you talked about this earlier, was the accountability. And there's a whole, I think, like an industry of, maybe you said it, showing accountability or showing why you need to have that program or to that extent. And this is where I do think that we do have a bit of a challenge, because an industry has been created there. And that's something I do worry about. And then we hear words like corruption and no transparency. And I think that is where we need to invest some time and energy and open up that area. So is that something you're concerned about and via some of the initiatives you're talking about, do you think that would kind of put that to rest?
Well, to the extent that if you have large public programs where there are millions or billions of dollars being paid out to different contractors, or are involved in that particular program. Again, the sort of the scale creates the risk, because you're building these things up into huge procurements or huge programs of work, which if they aren't technically perfect, are likely to fail in various different ways, and that may or may not be the fault of the contractor or whoever else, but inevitably, a lot of money is going to get wasted, and maybe some will get lost through corruption or other means. So it's that scale, it's that sense that everything should be the bigger is better, that we need to have these big programs that can address these big challenges, and they need to be designed up front really well, and then rolled out either with the private sector or with other actors. That whole way of working may be appropriate in certain circumstances, like building a battleship or whatever, but it feels like it's well, not just feels, we know it doesn't work, and fails in predictable ways in many other settings, and so that's why particularly for the more social types of challenge, or any challenge where it's difficult to say at the outset exactly what this is about or exactly what the answer is, because we just don't know, then you have to have a much more agile iterative approach. And if you have an agile iterative approach, you're not going to place a massive, huge bet at the beginning. And if you don't place a massive, huge bet at the beginning, you're not going to suffer some of the problems that you were highlighting.
I love the battleship example for what makes how it works. Do you have an example of where all of that upfront was put in and then massive failure at the end?
Well, there are lots. Unfortunately, there are quite a lot of programs like that have been
just
implemented.
Maybe a good one people can resonate with, so they understand it, they see it.
Yes. Well, look, I was personally involved, unfortunately, with one in the UK about 10 years ago, I suppose, which was about rehabilitation of prisoners after they're released from prison.
Okay.
And at the time, the government decided that they wanted to have private contractors, or at least third-party contractors, who would be paid on an outcomes basis to run programs with the ex-prisoners, so that they can reintegrate in society and get jobs and housing and all the rest of it. Unfortunately, because this was designed as a whole big, it was pretty radical, pretty experimental, because it was using a payment by results basis. That's quite a novel payment mechanism, and at that time anyway, in the public
payment
world.
By result.
Yeah, so that's saying some of your rather than paying you to do the service, so rather than saying we'll pay you to run this service to this set of standards, it's saying we don't care what you do, but if reoffending goes from 50% to 40%, then you'll get a payment for every amount that it reduces. So it's trying to incentivize innovation and different ways of working. And on paper, there's a lot to be said for this sort of conceptually, but because it was rolled out basically across the whole of England, I think, if I'm remembering the geographic extent of it, across England in one big go.
Yeah.
It was an untested market. The providers of these services didn't really exist. People didn't know how to design the payment mechanism, because that was novel as well. And it set itself up at the beginning as like, we've got this huge problem of reoffending, and here's the program that's going to solve it. This is going to be the answer. And it was just a huge catastrophe. And actually, the public services around rehabilitation have not really recovered in the UK to this day. I think they're still dealing with the consequences of that. So that, for me, and this isn't a political point about the party that implemented this, because I think any political party may have given this a go.
Seemed like a great idea.
It just sounds, when you play it back now, it sounds pretty hubristic to say that you can solve this problem, which is a very complex. Why people are in prison in the first place is complex, and then what they do afterwards is hugely complex. And to think that you could solve this with one program and one sort of magic payment mechanism that would fix everything clearly sounds far-fetched, and thus it proved to be. And I'm afraid that is just one example on many of government programs with the best will in the world. These are not bad people, right? These are people who want to make a difference on these challenges, but with the best will in the world, design policy and public programs, and maybe even institutions, with a mindset that is completely at odds with the reality and complexity of the challenges that they're trying to deal with. And, as I say, with predictable results.
Here's the big question. Do you think anybody learned from it that was in charge?
It's very difficult for me to say whether anybody learned from that. As you'll know, there's a new Labour government now in the UK, and that policy I described was done under the I think it may have been under the coalition or the Conservative-led anyway administration. I would like to think that the subsequent governments and the current government would not embark on such a program again. But if I'm honest, I think the lessons would be learned within the narrow domain. So it might be to say, we won't repeat the mistakes of that particular rehabilitation program, which would be good if that was said. What I am arguing for, though, is to say it's not that particular program in that particular set of circumstances that failed in that particular way. This is a general problem of many, many government programs for many, many different kinds of service that fail in exactly the same way.
Yeah.
So why do we keep making that same mistake again and again and again? Because if we don't do it in reoffending, we'll do it again in mental health services, or we'll do it again somewhere else. A different flavor of the same problem, which is a belief basically that you can control. You understand more than you actually do. That you can control more than you can, and that you can manage things in a way that actually is extremely difficult / impossible. But it's an uncomfortable truth, because in that world, it's like, oh my goodness, then what's to be done? But there are actually things that you can do, so that's what we argue for.
And so, do you see there's interest or uptake? And if so, where do you see the interest? You mentioned smaller communities. How is that even working?
I think oftentimes at a local level, a lot of what I'm describing is more intuitively understood and accepted. So when you're working within a city or within a community, you are that bit closer to the problem. You can see that it's not that straightforward, and it's not going to get solved by a quick fix. And therefore you embrace strategies which are more inclusive, more collaborative, more iterative, more learning oriented. So that we do see that happening in localities. And then there are some countries who are embracing this, and even international organizations as well. So often smaller countries, I have to say. So countries maybe like New Zealand or Finland. In Finland, there's been a movement around what they call humble government, which is to say, government is not the all-powerful answer to everything. We're humble in what we can achieve, right? That's an actual
such a novel idea.
That's an actual program in Finland. So often these countries I'm describing, and even Sweden, which I described earlier, are populations of perhaps 10 million or fewer. So they are actually the size of a city in another part of the world.
Yeah.
But equally, we've done a lot of work with organizations like the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, and they themselves recognize that when you're working in that space, you're wrestling with huge complexity often in very challenging parts of the world. And again, to pretend otherwise would be ridiculous. So in UNDP, there's been some really interesting work around creating more iterative approaches, using labs, being much more humble about what can be achieved, and not saying we're going to fix this problem, which is very, also, to be honest, very colonial mindset as well. Yeah. You can just come in from outside and fix the problem. So it is being picked up in many different places, and as the saying goes, the future is here. It's just not it's just unevenly distributed at the moment. So it's certainly not everywhere, and it's certainly not the main way that people think, but there are lots of great examples of people taking this kind of approach and achieving great results as an outcome of it.
Very interesting. And I'd like to get your thoughts on, because I think that humans, the ideal number, and I don't know where this is from, is like a tribe or so of 150 people. And so we live in a very different global world. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about that. But before, I don't know if you know this about Canada, but like how our system of government is structured federally, then provincially, and then municipally. And I'm encouraging as many people as possible to get involved on a local level. I think intuitively, because of lots of the things you said, on a provincial level as well, because of the distribution of powers. So that's a bit different. Because lots of the day-to-day, like healthcare and education and energy, actually is on a provincial jurisdiction. So very important things there. Yet, even though on a local level you can affect change quite a bit more, provincial, you have these huge responsibilities. Canadians focus a majority of their attention federally. And you see it even in terms of the voting turnouts, always higher on a federal level. And this is why I go to education, because a lot of people will be, going to their federal elected official talking about municipal or provincial problems, because those are the ones they're more familiar with. So that's the setup too in Canada. It's a little bit different, and I think you're familiar with it anyway, but I just wanted to throw it out there. But then what are your thoughts on localized versus national versus, and let's talk about global influence. I really appreciated when you said somebody else coming in, telling you what to do is colonial. And that's a great way to look at it, because people are frustrated with somebody else coming into their neighborhood and telling you, and is that the right direction? So some of your thoughts.
I think a mistake that we often make is to do the wrong things at the wrong level, right? So we often are trying to do things at a too high a level that are best done with locally. So the principle of subsidiarity is to push the decision making rights down to the level where they are best held. And I think we just, for whatever reason in our political systems, and again, we can probably quickly think of why this is the case, but decision rights do tend to get hoarded a bit too high up in the system, right? So we should be pushing those decision rights down. But that doesn't mean, just because you've handed the decision rights around how maybe details of the education system or the healthcare system are deployed in a local area, doesn't mean that you just then say, oh, well, you've got the decision rights, so I've got no role here. Because there are other very important roles that higher levels of the system can play. For example, like, how is information being shared and learned from across different provinces or across the system? That's a role that only really a higher level of the system can play to create that information ecosystem. But oftentimes that kind of role is either not considered as important, or is maybe a bit of an afterthought because they're too busy doing the other stuff, which frankly they shouldn't have been doing in the first place. So I would say, let's reevaluate at what level in the system what types of decision are actually being made and what roles are more appropriate for the different levels. And I think if you can get that right, you can create a system where, instead of you have different levels kind of competing with each other in a zero-sum game to say, if you have that decision right, then I don't have it, and it being that sort of a zero-sum mentality, you can have a more additive way of viewing, which is like, I'll do something that's in addition to what you're doing, that is enhancing to what you're doing, that is unlocking new value in what you do, and vice versa. And so it becomes a much more of a collaborative or sort of codependent system than a sort of hierarchical, like the decision was made here and it flowed up and down the chain. And honestly, a lot of the arguments we put forward at CPI are just moving away from a hierarchical framing to a more systems framing, where you have, instead of having actors reporting up and down, you have different players who've got different skills, different responsibilities, different points of view, working with each other. And how can you create that system that's healthy and oriented towards the challenge that's at hand? That's oftentimes what we're simply what we're trying to argue for.
Mm-hmm. I was just thinking about the example in Canada that the federal government recently was very keen on implementing a school lunch program across the country. And I'm sure you're familiar with Canada enough to understand how massive it is in geography, yet the population is so small. So if you think about it for a minute, thinking that somebody's going to be coordinating in one part of the country a school lunch program across, and I'm guessing about 8,000 kilometers from one area to the other, for rural kids and urban kids. And like, how on earth do we even think that makes sense?
Yeah. It's reminded me of an example from the UK during COVID, where because some children have free school meals in the UK, if you in a certain if you qualify for certain benefits as a family, then you would qualify for free school meals. And when the schools were closed during COVID, the government realized that there was a problem, because these children who would have been getting a nutritional meal or whatever at school were not going to be getting that. And what could they do about it? Now, there are many ways you could approach that. But if you're sitting in this, if you want to take the most top-down hierarchical approach, then you would do the following. You would say, well, we're going to contract a provider who's going to be given £6 per student or something, and they're going to go and buy some stuff, and then they're going to drop it off at your house so that you've got this lunch, right? And then people started taking photographs of this and sharing it on social media, and it was just it was awful. It was like, half a slice of bread and a carrot, and it was just low quality, not meeting nutritional needs, and apparently extraordinarily expensive, because of course that way of buying food is really inefficient. The other way of doing it would have just been to give everybody who we already knew all these people were, just to give them an extra 20 quid and say, sorry, we can't do the free school meals right now because schools are closed, but here's some extra money. We trust you to buy some food for your children.
Yeah.
But why that didn't occur to people is for all sorts of interesting reasons. Like, how do we trust people to be able to make decisions for themselves? And again, that public accountability for money. If we just give people money, then we can't say we can't say that they've spent it on the thing that they spent it on. Whereas if we can spend it through this other mechanism, we can at least prove it was they bought a banana. But that was such a waste. That was such a waste of money, and it was so hilariously bad. It became famous on Twitter at the time as a completely ridiculous policy. But that's probably a similar kind of example.
Yeah, well, I actually went to a quarantine hotel because I also wanted to see what it would be like in Canada, and incredibly expensive, moldy apples, and the worst food. Like we didn't eat it. It was terrible. So I experienced it myself. But one thing that this is the thing that bothers me the most about everything. And you said, and it's not what you're saying, but the attitude we have when we give people money. This is public money. And I just wrote about this yesterday because there was somebody celebrating how provinces or whoever is going to get from the federal government $1 billion a year. And I'm like, I'm tired of celebrating government officials, public officials giving public money for public infrastructure and services. That is the only reason they exist, in my opinion. This is not something we should be celebrating. This should be standard practice. So if you're giving people money to feed themselves, public money, and if that public decides they want to buy cigarettes with it, that's the life we have to live. And I think the disconnect that we have, because I've recognized I have maybe a little bit more of a libertarian view, which, to be honest, I didn't even know what that was a few years ago. But I think that we're missing the part of elevating the conversation and in educating people at the same time, because I think most people don't want to just say, don't interfere in my life, or I think most people would prefer that. But I think there's some fear there. But I want a safety net, so let's help people get out of that fear so that they can then thrive. Um, so that's something that comes up a lot as
Yeah.
well.
And I think you're right that there's a lot of this is about framing, and oftentimes we have a framing of like the person who's got the problem and the person who's going to solve the problem,
Yeah.
or the person who's got the money and the person who's going to receive the money,
Right.
or even as public services have become more marketized and the sort of consumerized,
Yeah.
customer and provider, right? These are
Mm-hmm.
all framings that set up a certain set of expectations in the minds of everybody involved that maybe have some benefits, but often have a lot of problems too. If you think you're a customer of a service, then you're not really involved necessarily in the co-production of the outcome, right? You're not sort of part of the conversation in the way that actually you are. If you're a student in a school, you're not really a customer of the school, right? You are
Yeah.
participating in a process of learning. So we have to be really careful how we frame these things up, I would say, is one point. And I would again come back to this. It's very hierarchical. When people feel that they're higher up the tree, then they want to be applauded for being beneficial to people lower down the tree. But the whole idea of this hierarchy was our invention in the first place, right? So that the idea that the higher levels of government are it somehow kind of giving the money back to, or not, they don't say giving back, right? They say they're distributing it and everyone should be happy.
Mhm.
This is a function of the way we view the system and a fact of the way the system has been established. And we can have a different system. We don't need to do it that way. And we can probably challenge quite how much money is taken right up into the center and then distributed out which creates the conditions for this in the first place. So I think, I would say yes to all of that. And the reason it exists is sort of a fundamental feature of the way the system has been designed, rather than any natural law that says it has to be like that.
Yeah. I don't know if you heard, but in Canada, it was just this week, the federal government gave a carbon tax rebate. And they actually on social media were like celebrating Canada tax rebate or carbon tax rebate, and all
Mm-hmm.
like on the Liberal Party who's in power were it was just, at that point it was a bit embarrassing too. It's great. Let's talk about the infrastructure. That was the example I gave before, but then this went to a whole other level. Very like, just I was like, I am not a child at like, I can't
Mm-hmm.
even believe that you think that this is appropriate. So
Mm-hmm.
anyway, the last thing, maybe before we wrap up here, um, and it was going to your last response and this one too, is I've had a really hard time with the words right and left, or the labels, and what people believe those are, because I think they've changed a lot in the last, I'd say 5-10 years especially. And where I think I see the dichotomy maybe more is where people are looking for government support or intervention versus people that want to be more autonomous. Is that what you're seeing? And is that a good direction, or is that actually a bit of a more difficult direction that we're going into? Your thoughts on that?
Well, I certainly recognize that dichotomy, and can see how that can divide people uh, politically, and people might feel that they're sort of on different sides of the aisle. Sometimes they're on
Yeah.
different sides of that discussion. I would, however, say that again, that sort of idea of like government either intervening or not intervening, sort of helping people or letting people make their own path, is still it's got a kind of paternalistic or not paternalistic angle to it. But there are other ways but again, that comes back to this idea that governments sort of like can choose to fix things or not fix things, or can choose to intervene or not intervene.
That was such a great conversation, Adrian. I appreciate all of that. And I think people will as well. I'm so excited to be having these conversations just so that we could have discuss how we could make changes, elevate the conversation, educate people. And I think people are really keen to get involved. They're just trying to figure out how. So I think that will really help. So, with that, maybe Adrian, if you could let people know where they can find you and those things.
Yeah, so the organization I run is called the Centre for Public Impact, and that is spelt the British way, with centre spelt CENTRE. If you look that up on the internet, you should find us. And if you want to get in touch with me, my email address is adrian@centreforpublicimpact.org. And very much welcome people getting in touch if they have questions or comments on anything we discussed today.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much. And then I'm going to keep you for a little bit longer. And I like to tell people it gets a little bit spicier on the other side. So thank you again so much. And maybe we'll do this again in the future.